In the deepest, suffocating depths of Hive Infernus, a solitary administratum scribe hunched over a ledger of shipping quotas. The air of Armageddon was always thick with the choking smog of promethium refineries and the metallic taste of endless industry. But on this day, the rote mathematics of imperial tithes failed. The heavy vellum parchment beneath the scribe's autoquill began to weep thick, hot blood. He stared in uncomprehending horror as the crimson fluid pooled over the stamped wax seals, dripping silently onto the iron desk. Above him, the heavy brass chronometers clicked in a sickening rhythm, the geared hands spinning furiously backward. Time itself was retreating from the horror that approached. The familiar, comforting scent of machine oil and smog was suddenly violently excised. In its place came the sharp sting of ozone, the heavy stench of old copper, and the gagging aroma of rotting meat. This was a world of pure, unyielding industry, built upon the rigid foundations of the Adeptus Administratum and the grinding gears of human labor. It was entirely unprepared for the death of reason. To understand a demonic incursion, one must realize that the warp does not merely invade physical space, it digests it. Long before the first drop pod falls or the first laser battery fires, the fundamental laws of physics begin to scream and fracture. And gravity sickens, light decays into sickly hues, and the minds of mortals buckle under the weight of impossible geometries. For 10,000 years, the primary defense of the imperial citizen has been absolute, enforced ignorance. The population of Armageddon had no concept of the Empyrean, nor the malevolent gods that dwell within its churning depths. That shield of blessed ignorance was utterly shattered in a single agonizing heartbeat. High above the rusted spires of the Hive cities, the void of space was torn apart. The space hulk known as the Devourer of Stars did not simply translate from the immaterium into real space as a ship would. It manifested as a festering, bleeding wound in the fabric of reality itself. It was a colossal, diseased mass of fused starships, asteroids and hatred, vomiting the raw stuff of the warp into the Armageddon system. Within its abyssal depths, a presence of pure, untrammeled rage stirred. It was an entity so vast and furious that its unseen proximity drove men to claw out their own eyes in the dark. The Red Angel had come to drown a world of steel in an ocean of boiling blood. Below, the terrified masses of the Hive workers felt a primal, predatory shadow fall across their souls. The scribe at his desk, surrounded by weeping ledgers and corrupted cogitators, knew only that the end of all things had arrived. The klaxons finally began to scream across the industrial wastes, a mournful dirge that came entirely too late. The planetary defense forces scrambled in the flickering lumen light, clutching laser guns with shaking hands, wholly unprepared for the apocalyptic nightmare manifesting in their skies. Down in the mud and ferrocrete of the primary defense lines, a veteran of the Armageddon Planetary Defense Force looked upward to see the heavens themselves bleeding. The skies above Prime turned the sickening hue of bruised flesh as reality gave way to the madness of the warp. From that torn firmament fell corrupted dreadclaws and assault rams, their ceramite hulls warped by the immaterium into twisted visages of screaming bone and jagged brass. They slammed into the trench networks with apocalyptic force, shattering bunker walls and crushing platoons beneath their unholy mass. Then the assault doors blew outward, and the true nightmare began. The World Eaters descended upon the mortal lines like a tide of crimson butchery. Beside them marched the demonic host of Khorne, creatures born purely of cosmic malice and endless slaughter. For the mortal soldiers bred on the strict, secular dogma of the imperial truth, the sight of these abominations was a psychological breaking point. Reason dissolved in an instant. Monoliths of winged terror stalked through the choking promethium smog, their very existence an affront to the natural laws of the material realm. Bloodthirsters towering over the battlefield swung colossal axes that actually wept and drank the vital fluids of the slain. These were entities of impossible geometry and hellish anatomy, moving with a supernatural speed that defied their mountainous bulk. Against such immortal wrath, the standard-issue laser gun was rendered utterly impotent. Volley after desperate volley of searing energy washed over the brass armor of the demonic vanguard, failing completely to singe the unnatural hides of the warp spawn. Men emptied their power packs in absolute terror, only to be cleaved in twain by sentient blades that sheared through flak armor, mortal flesh, and eternal soul alike. But the physical slaughter was merely a fraction of the doom brought to this world. From the blinding epicenter of the carnage emanated a wave of pure, unfiltered malice. It was the psychic shadow of Angron himself. The Red Angel projected an invisible aura of primordial rage, so intense it shattered the fragile minds of the defenders. Generational discipline evaporated into screaming lunacy in a matter of seconds. Loyal guardsmen, their sanity utterly destroyed by the sheer proximity of the fallen Primarch, suddenly turned their bayonets and las rifles upon their own trenchmates. Brother butchered brother in a frenzied madness, their foaming mouths screaming praise to a dark god they did not even comprehend. Officers emptied their bolt pistols into their command squads before turning their roaring chainswords upon the screaming wounded. Strategic coherence collapsed immediately into a sprawling, chaotic meat grinder of fratricidal horror. The massive mortal defense of Armageddon was entirely broken, reduced to a bloody rout that soaked the ash wastes in a crimson tide. Humanity stood weeping upon the precipice of absolute annihilation, drowning in an ocean of unavoidable doom. Only a supreme intervention born of genetic perfection and unyielding martial faith could possibly hold the line against this encroaching dark. The mortal line had shattered completely, leaving a world only moments from being swallowed whole by the Imperium. Into this absolute despair flashed the blinding light of the teleportarium. Brother Captain Taramar Aurelian felt the crushing pressure of the warp as he and his battle brothers materialized directly into the suffocating heart of the enemy. They did not strike at the flanks. They drove themselves like a silver stake into the very center of the blood god's most exalted bodyguard. 12 towering bloodthirsters, beasts of absolute fury and molten brass, roared their hatred at the sudden intrusion. Yet the knights did not falter. They were the Grey Knights, the final sanction of the master of mankind. Forged in utmost secrecy from the gene seed of the Emperor himself, they were a brotherhood of incorruptible psychers. Each warrior was a master of the esoteric arts, wielding nemesis force weapons consecrated in the blood of martyrs. Here, upon the broken earth of Armageddon, the purest, blessed silver of Titan clashed utterly against the corrupted, malefic brass of Khorne. But even the Emperor's ultimate demon hunters found themselves plunging into a tactical nightmare. To fight a Daemon Primarch is to face a cosmic disaster given physical form and boundless malice. Aurelian watched his brothers die in droves as the Red Angel fell upon them. With every swing of Angron's colossal black blade, reality itself screamed and fractured. The air bled psychic agony as the Demon Lord cleaved through Terminator armor and sacred wards alike. It was a visceral meat grinder that consumed the Emperor's finest without hesitation. Aurelian felt his own consciousness slipping away, his gene-enhanced biology failing rapidly under catastrophic physical and spiritual trauma. Through dimming eyes, he saw the broken ceramite of his brothers littering the ash. Exactly 109 Grey Knight Terminators had teleported into this crucible. Almost all of the 109 would give their lives to close the jaws of the trap. Through a haze of arterial spray and shattered bone, the 13 surviving knights channeled their dying psychic breath into one final, desperate strike. Their victory sealed only when a young battle brother shattered the Daemon Primarch's black blade with raw psychic fury. The resulting banishment of Angron was not a moment of glorious triumph. It was a visceral, agonizing tearing of the dimensional veil, an apocalyptic survival barely achieved through the blood of demigods. The Lord of the World Eaters was hurled screaming back into the warp, his monstrous physical shell detonating in a shockwave of ethereal fire that scoured the battlefield clean. Aurelian lay broken among the ruined bodies of his fallen brethren, his twin hearts slowing to a final, laboured halt. The first war for Armageddon had been bought with the blood of martyrs. The chaotic tide was broken, and the planet remained tethered to real space. Yet as the deafening roar of combat faded into a haunting, wind-swept silence, the surviving mortal defenders looked upon the devastation in shell-shocked awe. They had witnessed the impossible, gazing upon the absolute horrors of the Imperium and the Emperor's most secret warriors. They foolishly believed their salvation was at hand. They could not possibly know that for those simple mortals who had lived through this demonic incursion, the true, unrelenting nightmare was only just beginning. The ash of Armageddon settles against the shattered ferrocrete of the ruined Hive. For a solitary militia woman pulling her broken body from the rubble, the fading of the crimson sky into familiar, choking industrial smog is a vision of absolute salvation. She weeps bitter tears of exhaustion and relief, believing the nightmare has finally ended. The abominations have been banished back into the warp by the silver giants, and she has survived the unendurable. But the shadow that falls across her tear-stained face does not belong to a medical transport. Silent, obsidian dropships descend through the toxic clouds on vectors of perfect, mathematical precision. They bear no heraldry of rescue, only the cold iron sigil of the Ordo Malleus. The Inquisition has arrived. To the uninitiated mind, the sudden deployment of stormtroopers forming impenetrable cordons around the weeping survivors seems like the establishment of a secure triage zone. It is not. It is a quarantine of the soul. The sacred doctrine of the Inquisition dictates a terrible and absolute truth regarding demonic incursions. To know the demon is to invite the demon. Chaos is not merely a physical enemy that can be slain with bolter and blade, but an insidious plague that infects the very fabric of memory and thought. A single terrified mind, burdened by the forbidden knowledge of what dwells beyond the veil, can become a psychic gateway for a new invasion. One tainted soul, whispering of rotting gods and blood-soaked horrors in the dark, possesses the power to doom an entire sector of Imperial space. The holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition do not measure human life in individual heartbeats, but in the brutal calculus of galactic survival. Ignorance is the purest armor, and these survivors have been stripped bare of it by the very war they just won. There is no malice in the eyes of the inquisitorial agents marching through the ruins, only the chilling efficiency of supreme, unquestionable authority. They move with a bureaucratic finality that extinguishes the last embers of human hope. Searchlights cut through the gloom, illuminating endless rows of exhausted men and women being disarmed and separated. As the militiamen and hive gangers are herded into processing lines at the barrels of hell guns, a horrifying realization begins to ripple through the battered ranks. They are not being gathered to be healed, praised, or rewarded for their unimaginable bravery. They are being gathered because they looked upon the unnameable face of the arch-enemy. They fought with unwavering courage. They held the bleeding line against the darkness, and because they witnessed the true horrors of the galaxy, they must be completely erased from history. The exhaustion of survival swiftly pivots into a cold, suffocating terror. The immortal Silver Knights saved the physical world, but the Inquisition has arrived to save the Imperium from the witnesses. The victorious billions of Armageddon are no longer loyal citizens, but a catastrophic contagion risk awaiting their final, silent processing. The decree descended from the highest echelons of the Ordo Malleus, cold and absolute. We were the blunt instruments of that mathematical paranoia, simple void armsmen of the Imperial Navy repurposed into jailers. I stood upon the rusted gantries of the prison barges, my shock maul heavy in my grip, as we herded the bleeding saviors of Armageddon into the darkness. There was no malice in our orders, only the terrible calculus of the Inquisition. Billions of souls had looked upon the warp and survived, and for that miracle they were condemned. We fed them into the grinding gears of a macro slaughterhouse like raw gristle destined for the corpse starch vats. Families were severed. Regiments that had held the line against the abyss were stripped of their weapons and chained wrist to ankle. The logistics of erasing an entire civilization required an emotionless efficiency that still haunts my waking hours. We packed the heroes of the Imperium into massive processing camps that spanned the poisoned ash wastes. They were subjected to forced sterilization to ensure no tainted bloodline would ever plague the Emperor's realm. Those deemed useful for labor were marched into the deep Promethean mines, condemned to die slowly in the dark. Those who resisted, or who had looked too closely at the demonic tide, were given to the servitor chirurgeons. I watched the endless lines of mind wipes, the acrid scent of burned frontal lobes hanging thick in the recycled air of the medical bays. We hollowed them out, leaving behind vacant shells stripped of their memories, their bravery, and their humanity. They saved our world, and our reward was to erase their very existence. But this monumental betrayal did not go unnoticed. The Space Wolves had fought shoulder to shoulder with these mortal soldiers. When the Sons of Rust saw the processing camps and the sterilization wards, a righteous fury ignited within their hearts. The great wolf, Logan Grimnar, recognized the absolute honor of the Armageddon regiments. He saw our mechanical purge not as necessary salvation, but as an unforgivable dishonor. The Inquisition had treated his trusted allies as disposable assets in a paranoid game of containment. A suffocating tension took hold across the ruined system, marking the quiet, deadly dawn of what history would remember as the months of shame. Grimnar demanded the slaughter cease immediately. The wolves of Fenris bared their fangs at the agents of the Golden Throne, seething with a suppressed rage that threatened to tear the Imperial war machine apart from the inside out. The Inquisition refused to yield to the Adeptus Astartes. Their data slates and cogitators demanded a complete quarantine and execution of the sector. As the friction between demigod and inquisitor reached a breaking point, a desperate panic spread through the remaining civilian populations. Whispers of the sterilization camps and the lobotomy wards finally breached the blackout zones. The people of Armageddon realized that survival on the battlefield only guaranteed a quiet execution in the aftermath. They began to break the cordons. Thousands of makeshift transports and damaged freighters ignited their plasma drives in the dark, preparing to punch a hole through our blockade. The merciless order echoed through our fleet networks, commanding us to arm all macro cannons and prepare for the hunt. Beyond the atmospheric choked ash of Armageddon, the void of space offered no true sanctuary. A ragged armada of civilian transports, cargo haulers, and hastily retrofitted orbital lighters had broken the atmosphere in a desperate bid for salvation. They were packed with the traumatized survivors of the planetary purge, men and women who had endured the demonic horrors of the warp, only to face a far colder doom. Aboard the command deck of the Imperial cruiser Righteous Fury, the chronometers ticked down to the final execution of the inquisitorial mandate. The air was thick with sacred incense and the heavy silence of a condemned conscience. The absolute quarantine of the Armageddon system had been sealed by the Ordo Malleus. No soul that had witnessed the taint of chaos was permitted to live, lest the spiritual corruption take root elsewhere in the Emperor's realm. The shipmaster gave the firing order in a voice devoid of emotion, rendering himself a mere instrument of the Golden Throne. Gunnery officers, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of tactical cogitators, laid their trembling hands upon the heavy brass levers of the macro batteries. With faces like statues of cold iron, they pulled the heavy firing mechanisms. They felt no pity for the souls trapped within those fragile metal husks, for their obedience to the Golden Throne had long ago burned away such mortal frailties. Their duty to the master of mankind demanded the complete sacrifice of their own humanity. Colossal macro-cannon shells, each the size of a soaring cathedral spire, crossed the void in blinding streaks of kinetic fury. They tore into the unarmed refugee ships with apocalyptic violence. Fragile bulkheads ruptured instantly under the bombardment, spilling screaming families into the freezing vacuum of space. There was no sound in the great dark, only the silent blossoming of plasma fire and the expanding clouds of crystallized blood. Vessel after vessel was mercilessly reduced to drifting slag and shattered debris. The tactical sensors on the Imperial bridge registered millions of life signs blinking out in agonizing succession, a cold digital harvest of the innocent. This massacre was not born of sadistic malice, but represented the true, inescapable essence of the Imperium of man. To preserve the rigid, sprawling structure of humanity, the innocent must be ruthlessly fed to the pyres of necessity. The Inquisitors watched from their viewing pulpits until the final Auspex return faded into dead static. The fleeing multitudes were now nothing but radioactive ash drifting through the endless night. With this ultimate unforgiving sanction, the First War for Armageddon was officially concluded. Countless scribes deep within the Administratum began the laborious process of redacting the conflict from all Imperial records. The war never happened. The demonic incursions, the untold heroism, and the systematic slaughter of the planetary populace were meticulously wiped from the annals of history. Armageddon was deemed cleansed, a blank slate of scorched earth ready to receive a massive influx of oblivious, off-world colonists. The silent ashes of the murdered millions would merely serve as the foundation upon which the towering Hive cities would be born anew. Decades drifted away into the cold void of history. A grand procession of macro-transports darkened the skies of Armageddon once more. Billions of fresh souls were herded from the transit decks onto the ash-choked surface. To these new colonists, the world was presented as a pristine industrial jewel of the Emperor. They were told they had been chosen for a sacred duty to humanity. Armageddon was the beating heart of the sector. Its gargantuan manufactorums produced the tanks, the munitions, and the endless rivers of material required to sustain 1,000 distant war fronts. The survival of the Imperium in this segmentum relied entirely upon the tireless output of these continent-sized hives. Because of this supreme strategic value, the planet simply could not be abandoned. Yet the true cost of this immense industry was a rot that defied the cleansing fires of the Inquisition. The new worker caste descended into the lowest levels of the macro-habs and assembly zones. There, far beneath the gaze of their overseers, a nameless, bone-deep dread took root in their hearts. The warp leaves an indelible stain on the fabric of reality. Though the physical bodies of the tainted had been incinerated, their psychic echoes remained trapped within the ferrocrete foundations. A colonist would turn a rusted valve, only to find thick, dark blood seeping from impossibly cold pipes. In the sweltering heat of the Prometheum vents, the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the bulkheads. These unnatural silhouettes danced in the corners of the eye, whispering the names of the purged to minds entirely unaware of the slaughter. The very bedrock of the world was fundamentally cursed. Armageddon was no longer merely an industrial hub. It was a mausoleum masquerading as a forge. The new billions toiled in absolute engineered ignorance. They assembled weapons of mass destruction upon the mass graves of their predecessors. They lived out their short, brutal lives completely unaware of the demonic incursions that had torn their skies asunder. They knew nothing of the holy warriors who had bled for their salvation, nor of the inquisitorial decrees that had silenced the original population forever. Armageddon had become a graveyard built upon a graveyard. Its present was fueled by the forgotten agony of its past. The factories never ceased their deafening roar, churning out the machinery of war to feed a hungry Imperium. The immense tithes flowed outward into the stars, purchasing the survival of humanity with the cursed sweat of the oblivious. But a world steeped in such profound bloodshed cannot remain quiet forever. The psychic rot festered in the deep dark, a silent beacon calling out across the boundless ocean of the void. The sacrifice of the First Great War was buried deep beneath the ash, yet the lingering scent of endless slaughter drew the attention of new predators. Far beyond the edges of the system, an unimaginable tide of Xeno's malice was already gathering in the darkness. The ignorant children of the new order would soon face a reckoning of their own. Centuries turned to dust beneath the grinding wheels of the Imperium. Armageddon has long since recovered from the ashes of its ancient betrayals, blossoming into a mechanical leviathan of industry. Yet the true rot of a world rarely begins in the polluted sumps of its hive cities. It ferments at the very top. A junior liaison of the planetary defense forces stood trembling upon the mosaic glass floors of the high spire. The air in the sanctum was scrubbed and perfumed with the scent of off-world orchids, a staggering contrast to the choking, sulphurous smog that suffocated the billions toiling in the manufactorums miles below. Before him lounged Overlord Hermann von Strab. He was draped in imported spider silk and adorned with gemstones worth more than the combined tithes of a dozen hive cities. Von Strab was a creature of grotesque and oblivious luxury. He did not rule Armageddon. He simply consumed it. To understand the tragedy of Armageddon is to understand the institutional decay of the Imperial planetary governor. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the Adeptus Terra grants absolute authority to these inherited lords, trusting in their supposed divine right to rule. This vast autonomy breeds monsters not of the warp, but of pure bureaucratic vanity. Men like von Strab are insulated from the consequences of their own incompetence by layers of sycophants and impenetrable egos. They genuinely believe that the golden aquila upon their breast makes them untouchable. The liaison holds a slate, trembling with apocalyptic data. Distress signals echo from the outer system monitoring stations. Deep void augurs have detected a mass of incomprehensible scale drifting toward the Armageddon sector. It is a space hulk of monstrous proportions, an agglomeration of dead ships and orbital debris radiating ominous energy. The junior officer stammers out the warning, expecting the Overlord to sound the planetary alarms and mobilize the Steel Legions. Instead, von Strab barely glances up from his chalice of imported amasec. He waves a jewel-encrusted hand, dismissing the apocalyptic omen as a mere sensor glitch or perhaps a minor pirate flotilla. To his mind, no threat would dare challenge a world governed by his magnificent lineage. This staggering arrogance becomes the gravest weapon ever turned against the Hive world. It is the ultimate archetype of imperial negligence, a blindness born of privilege that dooms billions before a single shot is fired. While the Overlord feasts in his golden cage, the outer system bleeds. The physical signs of the approaching invasion are ignored, swept under the gilded rugs of the high spire. But there are other warnings, omens that cannot be silenced by a bureaucratic decree. Beneath the material veil, the Imperium is churning with an approaching malice. The sheer psychic weight of the gathering greenskin tide pushes ahead of the physical fleet, bleeding into the minds of the sensitive. Even as von Strab laughs in his sanctuary, a dark tide begins to drown the psychic frequencies of the planet. Lord Hermann von Strab could command the shuttering of the physical augur arrays, but he could not legislate the Imperium. Deep within the fortified spires of Hive Infernus, the astropathic choir of Armageddon sat locked in their sanctums. They were blind souls bonded to the psychic beacon of the Emperor, trained to listen to the subtle currents of the warp. What washed over them in those final hours was not a current, but a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered savagery. The ultimate doom of Armageddon was intrinsically tied to the primal nature of the Orc menace. When the ruinous powers of chaos breach the veil, their corruption manifests as insidious whispers. Demonic incursions bring a sickening unraveling of sanity that tempts and twists the soul with false promises. The psychic shadow of the greenskin is entirely different. It is a deafening, crushing roar of absolute violence. It is a primal storm generated by the collective will of the Orc species, a gestalt psychic field known as the Waaagh. When millions of greenskins gather, their shared belief generates a warp phenomenon so dense and aggressive that it suffocates the ethereal plane. The choir masters of Armageddon were the first to break. Their fragile minds, attuned to the delicate astro-telepathic relays, were suddenly hammered by a psychic bellow that echoed with the clashing of crude iron and the roaring of bestial throats. Sanctuary chambers quickly turned into slaughterhouses of the mind. Astropaths collapsed against the cold lumen grids, thick black blood pouring from their empty eye sockets and rupturing from their ears. Through shattered teeth and foaming lips, they began to chant in horrifying unison, their voices stripped of all humanity. He comes. The beast comes. Over and over the doomed psychers wailed this singular, terrifying truth until their synapses burned to ash and their hearts stopped dead. The beast they heralded was no mere warlord. It was Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. To call him an orc is a woeful understatement of the monumental threat he posed to the Imperium of man. Ghazghkull was a biological force of nature, an apex predator elevated to the terrifying status of a living god. He was the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, driven by apocalyptic visions that commanded him to unite the warring clans and unleash the greatest Waaagh the galaxy had ever seen. Under his brutal magnetism, disparate tribes and rival clans had been forged into a singular, unstoppable instrument of planetary execution. The sheer weight of these millions of orcs, all fervently believing in their own absolute invincibility, began to physically distort the reality of the Armageddon system. Space itself groaned under the immense pressure of their collective malice. The astropathic network of the entire sector was obliterated by the psychic feedback, completely blinding the Imperium to the disaster that was unfolding on the surface. In the deep void just beyond the reach of the silenced physical warning bells, the fabric of the Imperium tore open with violent force. Ghazghkull Thraka had finally arrived. A rusted, colossal armada of space hulks, weaponized asteroids known as rocks, and crude, scavenged warships blotted out the starlight, their massive engines burning with dirty radiation and unfiltered fury. The psychic screams of the dying astropaths faded into a hollow silence, soon to be replaced by the mechanical thunder of drop pods and boarding torpedoes loading into their launch bays. Armageddon was blind, deaf, and entirely alone as the great green tide prepared to break upon its vulnerable shores. The soot-choked skies above Hive Acheron tore open, vomiting a rain of fire and jagged iron. To the trembling guardsmen huddled in the cold mud of the outer defense trenches, it seemed as though the stars themselves were plummeting to crush the world. These were no elegant drop pods, but massive rusted orc landers bristling with crude thrusters and madness. The colossal dropships slammed into the ash wastes with the force of dying moons, throwing up tidal waves of irradiated earth and shattered rockcrete. The ground shuddered in violent spasms as the great invasion of Armageddon truly began. What poured forth from those smoking craters was not merely an army, but a biological plague of unparalleled horror. The true horror of the greenskin lies in the nightmarish biological resilience of their design. They are a weaponized fungal ecosystem walking upon two legs. From the moment they set foot upon a world, they begin to corrupt it. When a greenskin is struck down in battle, its dying act is to release millions of microscopic spores into the air and soil. These spores seep deep into the bedrock, gestating in the dark, giving birth to squigs, Gretchen, and eventually more of the orc warriors themselves. To allow the orcs to make planetfall is to curse a world for all eternity. Once the fungal tide takes root, the planet will never truly be cleansed of their taint. Through the settling dust of the impact zones emerged a living wall of screaming green muscle. They charged with a primal, deafening roar that shook the very souls of the defending mortals. Their weapons were rusted atrocities of scavenged scrap metal, bolted together with crude fury, yet terrifyingly effective in their brutal hands. Bolter fire and last beams tore into their chaotic ranks, ripping away chunks of thick flesh, but the horde did not slow. The most chilling realization for the soldiers of the Imperium was not the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, but the absolute absence of dread in their brutish eyes. The greenskin psychology is utterly xenos to human dread. They feel no sorrow for their fallen kin, interpreting even catastrophic casualties not as tragedies, but as a staggering escalation of the spectacle. They laughed as they died, and they roared as they butchered. Against this apocalyptic tide of violence, the Imperial defense lines stood little chance. The trenches were thinly manned, the soldiers malnourished, and their heavy weapon emplacements starved of promethium and power packs. This catastrophic vulnerability was the direct consequence of Overlord Hermann von Strab and his ruinous, arrogant neglect of the planetary tithes and defense logistics. Where there should have been impenetrable walls of overlapping artillery fire, there were only scattered, desperate volleys. The guardsmen fought with the stubborn courage expected of the Emperor's servants, but mere flesh and failing lasguns could not hold back a tsunami of manic butchery. The outer perimeters shattered in a matter of hours, drowning the screaming defenders in a tide of rusted blades and green fury. As the surviving elements of the planetary defense force fell back in bloody disarray, they prayed for salvation from the Hive spires above. Instead, they were about to receive an order of suicidal madness from the Overlord himself. Deep beneath the crumbling surface of the Hive city lay the primary command bunker of Overlord Hermann von Strab. While the conventional military forces bled and died in the choking ash wastes, the architect of their doom cowered behind layers of adamantium and void shielding. Panic had finally pierced the thick veil of his monumental arrogance. The green tide was no longer a distant nuisance, but an apocalyptic flood drowning an entire continent. Desperation breeds a unique kind of madness in the minds of cowardly men. Unable to face the reality of his strategic impotence, von Strab reached for a weapon of absolute indiscriminate annihilation. He gave the fateful order to unleash the planet's forbidden stockpile of ancient virus bombs. These were horrifying relics of a forgotten age, apocalyptic biological weapons once intended to scour entire continents of life. Yet, like all things under the Overlord's purview, the launch silos had been left to rot in negligent decay for generations. The sacred seals of the Departamento Munitorum were rusted and broken. When the launch codes were frantically entered, the wrath of the Emperor did not fall upon the Xenos horde. Instead, a tragedy of unparalleled proportions unfolded across the Imperial lines. Decaying containment flasks ruptured within their very launch tubes. Misfires and detonations tore through the subterranean silos, flooding the Imperial defense trenches with the ultimate contagion. Loyal guardsmen, who had stood resolute against roaring Xenos war machines, were reduced to sloughing pools of dark biomass in mere seconds. The agonizing screams of the faithful echoed through the Vox networks before dissolving into a wet, sickening silence. The Overlord's treasonous incompetence had achieved what the greenskins could not, permanently breaking the spine of the human defensive line. A meager fraction of the munitions did manage to clear their silos and fall upon the Orc vanguard. Glass canisters shattered across the polluted plains, unleashing an ancient, decaying viral strain, a ravenous contagion that violently dissolved flesh and bone into a bubbling necrotic sludge. Countless thousands of the brutes died agonizing deaths as their cellular structure violently unraveled. But the overarching tragedy lay in the terrifying resilience of the Xenos biology. The orcoid physiology, a nightmarish blend of animal endurance and fungal regeneration, resisted the decaying plague far better than any human frame ever could. The virus rapidly burned itself out against their unnatural vitality, leaving millions of the beasts severely scarred, but entirely unbroken. Von Strab had murdered his own finest regiments for a localized delay that bought the Imperium barely a single day of respite. Worse still, the apocalyptic firestorms ignited by the Life-Eater virus triggered a massive electromagnetic disturbance, severing all remaining communication channels across the globe. Planetary command was utterly annihilated in a blinding flash of friendly fire and sheer incompetence. The global defense network was now a scattered constellation of isolated outposts, blind and deaf to the approaching slaughter. The Overlord had inflicted more damage upon his own world than the initial Xenos landings had managed, yet in the suffocating darkness of this self-inflicted apocalypse, the ashes of catastrophic failure provided fertile soil for true defiance. From the shattered ruins of military command, the surviving remnants of humanity would look not to their treacherous planetary governor, but to a man who understood the uncompromising nature of total war. The stench of burning promethium and slaughtered men choked the air as the defensive lines dissolved into total anarchy. A terrified guardsman officer, bleeding and gasping, sprinted away from the slaughter as the green tide overtook the horizon. The command network was dead, drowned in the static of von Strab's catastrophic arrogance. There was only the animal instinct to flee. Then a shadow stepped into his path. It was an aging man, scarred but immovable, wrapped in the heavy black greatcoat of the Officio Praefectus. A fleeing colonel shoved past the young officer, screaming for the transports to abandon the Hive. The old man did not shout, nor did he draw his chainsword. He merely raised his stormbolter and blew the coward's head from his shoulders. The thunderclap of the execution stopped the rout dead in its tracks. Sebastian Yarrick had arrived. To the uninitiated masses, the Commissariat is a blunt instrument of terror and punishment. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of their sacred duty. The Officio Praefectus does not exist merely to execute the weak. They are the iron spine of the Imperial Guard. When the chain of command shatters, when structural integrity fails, and the minds of mortal men buckle under the unbearable horrors of the galaxy, the Commissar becomes the anchor of reality. They are the proxy of the Emperor's will, authorized to tear down failed leadership and forge a new hierarchy from the ashes. Yarrick embodies this grim doctrine with perfect, terrifying clarity. He does not offer the trembling survivors a grand speech of glory or salvation. He offers them a choice between dying like dogs in the mud or dying like men on the walls. Through sheer, suffocating competence, Yarrick imposes order over the panic. Under his unflinching gaze, weeping guardsmen pick up their lasguns and return to the barricades. The atmosphere of terror crystallizes into a state of grim, disciplined resolve. Exiled to Hades' Hive by the cowardly and incompetent planetary governor Hermann von Strab, Yarrick turns his cold fury upon the defense of his doomed post. Commandeering the disorganized remnants of the planetary defense force, the Commissar locks down Hades' Hive, while the aristocratic architect of this ruin cowers in a distant command bunker until true Imperial justice arrives. Hades' Hive is no longer a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. It is a fortress reborn in the image of its new master. Yarrick directs the defense with the precision of a master clockmaker, sealing blast doors, rationing ammunition, and fortifying every hab block. Across the poisoned ash wastes, the psychic shockwave of this sudden defiance ripples through the orc hordes. The mindless slaughter has been interrupted. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka feels the shift in the wind, a sudden resistance that speaks of a worthy enemy. The great beast turns his burning crimson eyes away from the shattered hive cities of the north, fixing his terrible gaze upon the single bastion of humanity that dares to stand unbroken. The Anvil is ready to receive the hammer stroke. To draw breath within Hades' Hive was to know that the sky itself had been murdered. To be a conscripted hive worker in those abyssal trench networks was to exist in a state of permanent, deafening terror. The heavens were entirely blotted out by a suffocating shroud of crematorium ash and the jagged black bursts of greenskin flak. There was no day, only a perpetual twilight illuminated by the sickly flash of endless artillery bombardments. The ground shuddered without pause, a mechanical heartbeat that liquefied the minds of men long before the shrapnel ever found their flesh. Hades' Hive had been transformed into an anvil of suffering, a grinder of plasteel and bone, where millions of souls were agonizingly fed into the dirt to hold a single irradiated mile of ash waste. Yet the true horror of Hades was not the volume of the slaughter, but the terrifying evolution of the enemy. The defenders expected the mindless, chaotic tide of roaring brutes that Imperial doctrine had promised them. Instead, they faced a nightmare of psychological warfare and cruel tactical acumen. Under the baleful shadow of Ghazghkull, the greenskin hordes moved with the precision of a disciplined Imperial siege regiment. They cut supply lines, orchestrated staggered bombardments, and launched perfectly timed flanking assaults that tore Imperial defensive lines to shreds. The beast had learned to think, and in doing so, it brought the defenders to the very edge of sanity. Amidst this suffocating despair, a singular mortal forged himself into a god of the trenches. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick walked the crumbling fire steps with a defiant majesty, his mere presence holding the fractured psyche of the planetary defense force together. But his legend did not end at the human barricades. Across the blasted wastes, the greenskins began to whisper a new name in reverent terror. To the orcs, he was no longer a mere human commander, but a mythological entity born of their own dark superstitions. He was Old Baal Eye, a creature of supernatural malice who could kill with a single glance. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka looked upon this unyielding defiance and experienced a profound, terrible revelation. The warlord realized that Yarrick was not a mere obstacle to be crushed beneath the iron tread of his crusade. Yarrick was a divine instrument, the ultimate crucible sent by his brutal gods to test the strength of his kind. The siege of Hades' Hive ceased to be a simple military objective. It became a dark sanctuary of mutual obsession, a focal point where the greatest champions of two warring species anchored their very existence to the destruction of the other. The lines were drawn tighter every hour, collapsing inward toward the broken heart of the Hive city. The vast theatre of global war narrowed down to a claustrophobic nightmare of shattered corridors and burning hab blocks, pushing ever closer to the moment when the architect of humanity's survival would be forced to cross blades with a monster of apocalyptic proportion. The outer walls of Hades' Hive collapsed not with a single catastrophic detonation, but through the grinding attrition of relentless green tides. Through the shattered ferrocrete poured the savage vanguard of the orc horde, bringing the slaughter into the claustrophobic corridors of the hab blocks. At the apex of this brutal breach stood war boss Ghazghkull, a towering monstrosity of scarred muscle and crude mechanical augmentation. To meet him stepped Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, an aging mortal man armed with nothing but a chainsword, a bolt pistol, and an indomitable will. There was no poetry in their clash, nor any of the graceful artistry chronicled in the sanitized frescoes of the ecclesiarchy. This was a desperate, ugly struggle waged in ankle-deep blood and the choking dust of pulverized masonry. Ghazghkull was a force of primal ruin, his massive power claw carving through plasteel bulkheads and human flesh with equal disdain. With a single devastating sweep, the warboss brought that crackling appendage down upon the commissar. The sheer force of the blow cleaved cleanly through bone and armor, severing Yarrick's right arm just below the shoulder. Any ordinary man would have fallen, succumbing instantly to the blinding shock and catastrophic blood loss. Yet Yarrick was no ordinary man, for his soul was forged in the absolute furnace of Imperial duty. Harnessing the immense surge of adrenaline and the raw agony of his mutilation, the commissar did not retreat. He stepped forward into the spray of his own lifeblood. Before the roaring warboss could comprehend the defiance of his mortal prey, Yarrick drove his screaming chainsword upward in a vicious, desperate arc. Whirling adamantine teeth bit deep into thick orc hide, tearing through muscle and cartilage until Ghazghkull's severed head tumbled into the bloody muck. Silence, heavy and absolute, descended upon the surviving Xenos as they witnessed their unstoppable warlord slain by a broken, one-armed human. Yet the true birth of Yarrick's legend occurred not in the mud of the breach, but in the sterile gloom of a field apothecarion. Refusing the mercy of sedatives, the commissar ordered the Adeptus Mechanicus engineers and Medici chirurgians to perform an act of unspeakable, borderline heretical technosurgery. He commanded them to strip the massive, crude power claw from the corpse of Ghazghkull and graft it directly onto his own severed stump. This agonizing procedure was far more than a mere physical replacement of a lost limb. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, born from Yarrick's profound understanding of the Xenos mind. The commissar knew that the orc species was united by a crude but devastating psychic gestalt, a collective subconscious where their deepest beliefs manifested into reality. The greenskins already whispered that the old man of Hades was a terrifying, unkillable phantom. Yarrick chose to weaponize that very superstition against them. By taking the strength of their greatest chieftain and wielding it as his own, he validated their darkest fears. He became the monster they believed him to be, a living avatar of retribution stalking the nightmare-haunted ruins of Armageddon. The sight of this mutilated, augmented terror shattered the morale of the Xenos invaders, turning their savage momentum into disorganized panic. The impossible resilience of one man had broken the spirit of the green tide, holding the bleeding world together just long enough for the heavens to finally tear open. For countless days, the mortal defenders of Armageddon had bled in the choking mud, paying for every second of survival with millions of shattered lives. Now, the turbulent warp currents finally parted, and deliverance came screaming from the poisoned heavens. To ride within the armored womb of a space marine drop pod is to know the wrath of the Emperor made manifest. Through the suffocating ash clouds, meteors of crimson ceramite plummeted toward the ruined crust of the world. Commander Dante had arrived, bringing the true angels of death to the besieged plains of Armageddon. Where the Imperial Guard fought a war of grinding, desperate attrition, the Adeptus Astartes delivered surgical divine violence. They did not hold the trenches. They shattered the enemy entirely. The Blood Angels struck the Orc hordes with the fury of a dying sun, a crimson spear thrust directly into the brutal heart of the Xenos siege. The greenskins, accustomed to the slow slaughter of weary mortals, were unprepared for such majestic brutality. Bolters roared with holy purpose, and chainswords sang hymns of butchery as the noble warriors carved a path toward Hades' Hive. Yet even the flawless sons of Sanguinius are not immune to the unnatural horrors of the Xenos. At the absolute vanguard of the assault fought Captain Erasmus Tycho, a shining paragon of his storied chapter. While spearheading a brutal counter-assault to break the Orc lines, Tycho was caught in the devastating backlash of a weird boy's psychic manifestation. Crackling emerald Waaagh energy washed over the warrior, melting the pristine flesh of his face into a grotesque, fused ruin. The physical agony of that horrific wound was profound, but the true devastation was wrought upon his soul. Behind the scarred visage of the captain, a dark and terrible seed was planted. The ancient, tragic curse of his bloodline stirred within his mind, whispering of the black rage that would eventually claim his sanity. Despite this grievous toll, the unyielding fury of the Blood Angels broke the endless siege of Hades. The Orcs were routed, broken, and driven back into the desolate ash wastes in absolute disarray. Commissar Yarrick stood victorious amidst the rubble, a battered and exhausted savior weeping for a dead city. It was a profoundly Pyrrhic triumph. Hades' Hive, the great monument of human defiance, was utterly destroyed, reduced to a hollow graveyard of twisted iron and countless bones. More maddening still was the sickening revelation that the great beast had eluded Imperial justice. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka did not stay to perish in the smouldering ruins of his stalled conquest. Believing the truest test of his horde had only just begun, he withdrew to his towering space hulks and plunged back into the cold void. The monstrous warlord had not been seeking mere planetary conquest. He had been searching for a proper galaxy-shaking war, and the Imperium had given him a taste of the ultimate battle. Armageddon survived the storm, but it was deeply, irreparably scarred by the wrath of the beast. The fires of the Second War slowly burned down to embers, leaving behind a ruined landscape and a lingering shadow of dread. The Xenos warlord was gone, but the galaxy would only have 57 years to rebuild before the ultimate rematch would drag them back into the fires of annihilation. "57 standard years have ground themselves to dust since the beast departed our shattered world. My organic eye sees the endless lines of macro cannon batteries and void shields that have choked the ash wastes of Armageddon. My cybernetic auger peers upward, forever scanning the cold void beyond the polluted clouds. We spent half a century turning this planet into a fortress of unparalleled defiance. We poured the blood of millions into the mortar of new Hive walls, believing we were preparing for a second siege. Commissar Yarrick knew the truth, even as his own flesh withered and his paranoia deepened into a holy, consuming fire. He told us the monster had not merely survived, but evolved, enlightened in the brutal calculus of total war. The High Lords of Terror celebrated a victory, but the old man with the Baal eye understood that Armageddon was merely a classroom. While we fortified a single sphere of rock, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka travelled the screaming darkness of the galaxy. He did not lick his wounds in the shadows. He forged an empire of ruin. He battered the chieftains of 1,000 feral worlds into absolute submission, uniting the disparate and warring clans under a single terrifying banner. He learned from our Commissar, adopting the brutal logic of imperial attrition and the cold calculus of total war. The greenskin was no longer a mere warlord driven by base instinct. He had been touched by the divine madness of his savage gods. He had become the prophet of the Waaagh. A creeping, paralyzing dread settled into my auger link when the deep space warning sirens began to howl. We realized our fatal arrogance in that singular, heart-stopping moment. We spent those decades preparing for a rematch. The prophet spent the exact same decades preparing for total annihilation. The auger arrays did not simply register incoming vessels. They registered the death of the stars themselves. The darkness between the constellations blotted out, replaced by an armada of scrap metal leviathans so vast it defied the sanity of our machine spirits. It was the largest concentration of greenskin warships in the recorded history of the Milky Way. They came not to conquer our world, but to erase it from the celestial map in a tide of blood and burning promethium. The sky above Hive Tartarus turned the color of bruised iron as the first vanguard shadows eclipsed our sun. We gripped our weapons and prayed to the master of mankind, realizing too late that our mighty planetary fortress was nothing but a designated slaughterhouse. The heavens above our trembling heads finally tore open. Deep within the armored heart of the orbital defense station, his will, an Imperial Navy auger operator, stared into the abyss of his lumen displays. The translation from the warp was not a localized tear, but a hemorrhagic rupture across the entire system. The sacred cogitators of the station screamed a mechanical death rattle. The Auspex screens literally shattered, their crystalline matrix unable to process the sheer, impossible mass of the incoming Orc armada. It was a fleet that defied the sanity of Imperial logic. To the uninitiated, the greenskin relies on primitive brute force. Yet the Third War revealed a terrifying evolution in Orc mechanical savagery. At the vanguard floated the space hulks, colossal amalgamations of dead ships dragged from the treacherous currents of the Imperium. Flanking these leviathans were the rocks. These hollowed asteroids were stripped of their natural ore and packed with unstable fusion generators, functioning as immense weaponized battering rams. They were fitted with crude but devastating teleporter arrays, allowing the greenskin vanguard to beam directly past the Imperial void shields. Monstrous tractor beams, welded together from the butchered husks of scavenged frigates, lashed out to drag Imperial vessels into fatal collisions. The Orc mechboys had harnessed the raw momentum of their violent psychic gestalt to power brutal engines that should have torn themselves apart. The ensuing naval engagement was not a battle, but an execution. The pride of the Segmentum Solar unleashed disciplined broadsides of lance strikes and macro cannon fire. Titanic lance beams burned deep, molten craters into the approaching behemoths, yet the damage was entirely superficial. The sheer kinetic mass of the Orc ships simply absorbed the punishment and continued their relentless advance. In the cold vacuum, the massacre played out in absolute silence. Within the cramped corridors of the dying Imperial cruisers, that silence was replaced by the deafening shriek of breach alarms and the frantic prayers of drowning men. Gothic prows were pulverized beneath the grinding bulk of asteroid fortresses. Noble vessels were cracked open like brittle bones, their atmospheric lifeblood venting into the void in frozen crystalline clouds. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka did not merely break the orbital blockade, he overwhelmed it through a terrifying application of sheer kinetic mass and brutal attrition. The heavily fortified equatorial seaport of St. John's Dock was catastrophically bombarded from orbit by an advancing space hulk, its desperate distress signals drowning in static and absolute terror. The burning wreckage of the Imperial Navy fell as a rain of iron fire upon the atmosphere below. The void belonged to the beast. The sky over Armageddon was completely controlled by the roaring, rusted might of the Orc Armada. As the orbital debris cleared, millions of crewed drop pods and assault landers began their unhindered descent toward the ash wastes. The heavens burned with the friction of the incoming horde. The first line of defense had fallen in hours, leaving the doomed planet entirely exposed. A planetary invasion of unprecedented scale had begun, thrusting a burden of unimaginable slaughter and global attrition onto the exhausted shoulders of Commissar Yarrick. Deep beneath the fortified crust of Armageddon Secundus, the air in the Supreme Command Center was heavy with the acrid stench of cigar smoke, stale sweat, and unfiltered despair. 1,000 Vox channels screamed in a continuous, deafening chorus of panic and slaughter. With orbital supremacy irrevocably shattered, the green tide had washed over the world in a singular apocalyptic wave. There was no longer a traditional front line for the Imperial Guard to hold. Commissar Yarrick stood at the center of this sensory maelstrom, a solitary bastion of iron will amidst the unraveling of an entire world. He did not listen to the desperate pleas for reinforcements or salvation echoing from the crackling speakers. Salvation was a luxury the Imperium could no longer afford. Before him glowed the massive hololithic projections of a dozen isolated mega-sieges, detailing the logistical nightmare of a pan-continental war. Armageddon was no longer merely a planet. It had been transformed into a single, unbroken trench system spanning millions of square miles of toxic wasteland. To fight the Xenos menace in the open was to invite immediate and absolute annihilation. Therefore, Yarrick engaged in the cold, unforgiving calculus of the Imperial war machine. With a single command, he made the agonizing decision to completely abandon the sprawling ash wastes. Billions of human souls, scattered across vulnerable mining outposts and lesser hab blocks, were intentionally left to perish in the irradiated deserts. Their lives were entirely forfeit, brutally traded for the precious hours needed to seal the blast doors of the towering Hive cities. Every order Yarrick issued in that smoke-filled bunker was a death warrant for hundreds of thousands of loyal soldiers. Magnificent regiments of the Astra Militarum, drawn from 100 different worlds, were coldly reduced to disposable integers on a grand strategic ledger. This was not a war of heroic victories or sweeping strategic maneuvers. It was a masterclass in the grim strategy of absolute meat-grinder attrition. The old man of Armageddon understood perfectly well that he could not achieve a conventional victory against a horde of such infinite numbers. His ultimate goal was far more terrifying and pragmatic. He intended to make the subjugation of his world so excruciatingly expensive that the Orc Waaagh would simply burn itself out. He would force the Xenos war machine to gorge upon an endless diet of human flesh and shattered plasteel until its furious momentum violently collapsed. In the chilling mathematics of human sacrifice, a Hive city was no longer a sanctuary for citizens, but a vast, mechanized trap designed to slaughter as many invaders as possible before it inevitably fell. The exhausted comm officers wept openly as they transmitted orders to hold positions at all costs, knowingly condemning their brethren to agonizing deaths. Yarrick merely watched the staggering death tolls rise, his baleful bionic eye whirring with calculated mechanical indifference. The surface of the planet had fractured into a network of planetary slaughterhouses. Each major hive became a besieged island of humanity, entirely suffocated by a raging ocean of green fury. From the frozen peaks of the Deadlands to the suffocating equatorial jungles, the horrific reality of Yarrick's strategy was realized in rivers of blood. Yet among these desperate, towering bastions of defiance, the true nature of this brutal calculus would be tested to its absolute breaking point. The grand orchestration of global slaughter now draws our gaze downward into the smog and the ash, focusing the lens of history upon the doomed industrial port of Hive Helsreach. Commissar Yarrick understood the brutal mathematics of this war. To bleed the Orc invasion of its momentum, every Hive city had to become an anvil upon which the greenskin tide would break. Nowhere was this bloody toll paid more willingly than in the industrial sprawling nightmare of Hive Helsreach. Sent to anchor this doomed bastion was a small contingent of the Black Templars. They were led by Reclusiarch Grimaldus. To understand the Black Templars is to understand fanaticism distilled into its purest, most lethal form. They do not merely serve the master of mankind, they worship him with a violent, unrelenting zealotry that views compromise as treason and retreat as a mortal sin. Grimaldus was the living embodiment of this transhuman fury. He did not view the defense of Helsreach as a tactical necessity. He viewed it as a holy sacrament. The heart of this sprawling hive was the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant. It was a staggering architectural marvel of faith, a massive cathedral whose vaulted ceilings and adamantium pillars reached toward the ash-choked heavens. This sanctuary held the very spirit of the city. It was here that the true disparity between mortal and space marine was laid bare. The human defenders of Helsreach were cynical, exhausted, and terrified. They were dock workers clutching rusted autoguns, indentured labourers with shaking hands, and militiamen who had already accepted their own brutal end. They looked upon the Black Templars not as saviours, but as terrifying demigods of war. The towering transhumans clad in midnight ceramite moved with a predatory grace that defied their mass. Their very presence was an oppressive weight upon the fragile mortal mind. Grimaldus did not offer the trembling masses comforting lies of survival or glorious victory. When the Reclusiarch spoke, his voice was a thunderous grinding of stone that demanded nothing less than absolute martyrdom. He promised them only that they would die. He swore that their blood would water the foundations of the Holy Temple and that their final breaths would be spent screaming defiance into the faces of the Xenos horde. This was the terrifying gift of the Black Templars. They forged the broken spirits of ordinary men and women into a weapon of pure, suicidal zeal. The sheer awe of standing beside a true angel of death paralyzed the dockworkers with terror, yet it also stripped away their fear of the encroaching greenskins. If a demigod of the Emperor demanded their lives, they would surrender them without hesitation. The Orc siege lines drew closer with every passing hour. The horizon burned with the fires of 1 billion roaring engines, and the ground trembled beneath the boots of the green tide. Grimaldus stood upon the grand steps of the basilica, his Crozius Arcanum humming with lethal energy. He looked upon his doomed congregation of mortals and battle brothers alike, binding them all to a single immutable oath. They would not take one step backward. They would hold the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant until the walls shattered around them and the sky collapsed upon their heads. I lie down upon the shattered marble of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant. My lower half is simply gone, chewed away by the cruel shrapnel of Xenos rockets. I cannot feel the pain anymore, only the cold creep of the void drawing near. High above my paralyzed body, the magnificent stained glass windows depicting the glorious Primarchs detonate inward. Heavy, solid slug weapons of the greenskin horde shatter the millennium of peace within these walls. A jagged storm of coloured glass rains down upon the dying and the dead. Then comes the deafening roar. It is a wall of pure sound, the combined battle cry of millions of monstrous beasts pouring into the holy sanctuary. They crash through the shattered oak doors like a tide of pestilence. The stench of them is suffocating, a foul musk of feral sweat and hot engine oil that drowns out the sacred incense. I can do nothing but bleed and witness the final moments of our doomed defiance. Yet in the centre of the ruined nave, our defiance still breathes. Reclusiarch Grimaldus stands alone as a whirlwind of midnight armour and unyielding hatred. His plasma weapon burns brilliant and hot through the gloom, reducing screaming brutes to scattered ash. His Crozius Arcanum is a terrifying blur of crackling, disruptive energy. Every thunderous swing crushes thick skulls and splinters crude iron armor. He chants the litanies of hate, his amplified voice booming over the chaos of the slaughter. He fights not for our salvation, but to ensure the enemy drowns in the blood of their own kind. But the great temple cannot bear the physical strain of this apocalyptic blasphemy. I feel the immense structure dying beneath my cold hands. The deep, agonizing groans of stressed plasteel and cracked bedrock echo louder than the endless bolter fire. Thick grey dust chokes the recycled air, turning the holy sanctuary into a suffocating twilight. Massive stone gargoyles tear free from their ancient perches on the vaulted ceiling. They plummet directly into the surging sea of green flesh. The falling statues crush scores of beasts into paste before detonating into lethal shrapnel. The immense Gothic pillars finally buckle under the sheer concussive force of the relentless Xenos artillery. With a final shriek of tearing metal, the heavens fall upon us. The ceiling collapses in a terrifying tidal wave of masonry, iron and ash. I watch the Black Templar hero strike down one last Xenos warlord before the colossal mountain of rubble consumes him entirely. Grimaldus is buried alive in the crumbling grave of our Imperial faith. My vision fades to black as the crushing weight of the cathedral takes me. The last human defenders are wiped out. The sprawling ruins of Hive Helsreach finally belong to the Xenos. But the victory they claimed today was bought at a ruinous cost. The delay our final stand forced upon the invaders is measured in vast oceans of green blood. We broke the sheer momentum of their primary invasion wave. Now the smouldering ashes of our murdered city drift slowly upward into the tortured atmosphere. The thick smoke joins the gathering tempest brewing high in the ruined skies. A terrible and dramatic shift in the planetary ecology is beginning to manifest. The air grows unnaturally hot as the airborne chemical fires ignite the upper stratosphere. The time for conventional warfare in the shadow of the hives has ended. The shifting winds bring only the devastating dawn of the season of fire. The grinding meat grinder of the Hive cities was but a prelude to a far older and crueler enemy. The celestial clockwork of the Armageddon system is without mercy. As the world tilted upon its axis, the primary continent was thrust relentlessly toward the local star, plunging the war zone into the dreaded season of fire. Through the fever-blurred eyes of a low-ranking Munitorum logistics officer, the true nightmare of this epoch is laid bare. He tallies the dead in a subterranean bunker, yet the parchment crumbles in his blistered hands, the ink drying before the quill can scratch the ledger. Heatstroke claims his mind, transforming his meticulous manifests into delirious scrawls of impending doom. The ambient temperature beyond the reinforced hive walls has shattered all survival parameters, rising steadily until the very air turns to poison. Armageddon possesses an ecology forged in malice. The toxic ash wastes, already an inhospitable desert of industrial ruin, become a weaponized atmospheric anomaly. Lethal thermal drafts whip the settled dust into towering hurricanes of molten glass and scouring fire. Out in the blasted wastes, the reality of trench warfare descends into unimaginable hell. The sucking, blood-soaked mud of previous months does not dry. It flash-bakes into razor-sharp ceramic, entombing the fallen and trapping the living in trenches that feel like the kilns of the Mechanicum. To touch the parapet is to sear the flesh from the bone. To breathe is to invite the flames into the lungs. The valiant soldiers of the Astra Militarum find no salvation in their war gear. Standard-issue flak armor, designed to absorb shrapnel and deflect last fire, acts as a thermal coffin. Guardsmen are cooked alive within their own breastplates. Thirst becomes a madness that eclipses all fear of the Xenos. When a desperate soldier reaches for his canteen, he finds no relief. The water rations literally boil within their metal flasks, scalding the throats of those driven mad enough to drink. The environment itself steps forward as the apex predator of this war, harvesting human lives by the millions in a silent and suffocating slaughter. Yet the greenskin horde does not halt. Where humanity withers beneath the wrath of the sun, the orcs revel in the apocalyptic inferno. The monstrous Xenos thrive in the scorching heat, their spore-laden physiology hardening in the blast furnace conditions. They charge through the glass storms with joyous, roaring fury, their crude metal armor glowing red-hot. They do not feel the agonizing sting of the ceramic earth, nor do they falter when the air itself catches fire. This unholy resilience forces the war into an agonizing, bloody stalemate across the baking continent. Nowhere on land offers sanctuary from the celestial wrath. The logistics officer asks the Emperor for salvation in his final heat-maddened report, noting the changing conditions of the great equatorial ocean to the south. The continent burns, but the seas themselves have begun to roll with a sickening, churning froth. The temperature of the deep waters rises to a rolling boil, sending colossal pillars of scalding steam into the choked sky. It is upon these deadly, superheated waves that the next theatre of this endless war will unfold, just as the architect of this slaughter turns his gaze toward the stars. Beneath the suffocating ash of the surface, the nightmare of Armageddon plunged into the abyss. The equatorial oceans of the world were not sanctuaries of cool water, but seething cauldrons of toxic sludge and boiling brine. Deep within this crushing blackness, Imperial hunter-killer submarines prowled the benthic trenches. The crews lived in absolute claustrophobia, their sonar pinging against the thermal vents of a dying world. They believed themselves safe from the savage hordes above. They were wrong. From the murky depths emerged monstrosities of rusted iron and riveted scrap. The orcs had engineered crude, impossible submersibles that defied every law of hydrostatic pressure. These mechanical leviathans rammed into the structural pillars of the underwater Hive cities. Green tides of Xenos spilled into the breached habdomes, turning the ocean floor into yet another slaughterhouse. Nowhere on Armageddon was spared the wrath of the beast. Yet at the absolute apex of this global butchery, the Auspex arrays of planetary command registered an impossible phenomenon. A massive fleet displacement echoed through the upper atmosphere. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was breaking orbit. The greatest warlord of the orc race was not retreating, nor had he been broken by the stalemate of the Season of Fire. He was simply bored. In his brutal cunning, the prophet of the greenskins had realized his terrifying masterpiece. He had not come to conquer Armageddon, but to forge it into an eternal engine of conflict. He had created the ultimate grinding wheel to test and harden his endless Xenos tides. With the planet perfectly trapped in a perpetual cycle of absolute war, Ghazghkull turned his gaze toward the wider galaxy. He departed to spread his apocalyptic crusade to 1,000 other stars. In the command bunkers of Hero of Helsreach, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick watched the tactical hololiths flicker and fade as the orc flagship tore into the warp. There was no relief in the old man's singular, glowing, augmetic eye. There was only a cold, unfathomable fury. Yarrick understood the grim truth that eluded the celebrating planetary governors. The beast had won. Ghazghkull had weaponized the very concept of attrition, and Yarrick refused to let this cosmic insult stand. The old man of Armageddon would not remain to manage the slow, bleeding decay of the world he had fought so desperately to save. Yarrick cast aside his defensive mandate and requested an audience with the Adeptus Astartes. Boarding a Black Templar's strike cruiser, the Commissar allied himself with High Marshal Helbrecht to hunt the prophet across the endless void. They plunged into the Imperium, leaving the toxic, boiling jewel of the Armageddon sector behind. The world was abandoned to its fate, locked in a meat grinder of trench warfare and submarine massacres that would endure for centuries. Armageddon bled, its billions of souls entrenched in a war without end. Yet as Yarrick hunted the beast through the dark, the very fabric of the galaxy began to groan under a pressure far worse than the Xenos menace. A tectonic shift in the warp was coalescing, preparing to tear the heavens themselves asunder. Decades had ground the Third War for Armageddon into a monument of stagnant butchery. In the flooded trenches of the Tartarus sector, An exhausted Ministorum priest raised his tarnished aquila aloft. His voice was a ragged croak, reciting the litanies of endurance over the ceaseless thunder of orc artillery. Generations of Imperial citizens had been born in these deep earthworks. Entire bloodlines had perished, knowing absolutely nothing but the acrid stench of promethium and the deafening roar of greenskin hordes. But the prayer of the weary priest was never finished. Without warning, the heavens above Armageddon literally tore in half. There was no physical sound to announce the catastrophe. Instead, a profound and deafening silence smothered the entire world as the Cicatrix Maledictum opened its terrible maw across the length of the galaxy. Real space shrieked and gave way to the impossible. The sky of Armageddon split from horizon to horizon, revealing a cosmic abyss of churning psychic energy. The Great Rift had swallowed the stars. In that terrible instant, the entire Imperium was severed. The radiant light of the Astronomicon, which served as the Emperor's guiding beacon, was instantly extinguished by a suffocating tide of warp interference. Armageddon was cast into absolute cosmic isolation. Deep within the command sanctums of the Hive cities, every astropath and sanctioned psyker seized in unendurable agony. Their skulls detonated in sprays of gore under the overwhelming pressure of 1 trillion screaming warp entities. The fundamental laws of physical reality began to shatter across the planet. Gravity inverted violently in the deep ash wastes. Blackened blood rained upward from the endless killing fields. Time itself fractured, creating localized temporal loops where dying guardsmen screamed their final breaths for an agonizing eternity. For the surviving Imperial defenders, the absolute despair of this moment defied all mortal comprehension. They had bled for a lifetime simply to hold the line against the beast. They had sacrificed tens of millions of souls just to push the orc menace back a few bloody inches. Now the literal forces of hell had come to claim the ruined world. The unspeakable horrors of the First War had returned to finish the apocalyptic slaughter that the Red Angel began centuries ago. The atmospheric canopy of the world shifted from the grey of toxic smog to the sickening colour of bruised flesh. It was a morbid and undeniable echo of a nightmare the holy orders of the Inquisition had tried so ruthlessly to erase from history. Impenetrable warp storms enveloped the system, entirely cutting off any desperate hope of reinforcement or retreat. The delicate veil between dimensions grew so thin that the air itself began to weep. Amidst the rusted miles of barbed wire and the towering mountains of greenskin dead, the Materium finally broke. Rifts of burning brimstone and jagged brass erupted directly into the heart of the devastated landscape. Nightmarish legions of the Immaterium stepped through the boiling breaches, eager to reap mortal souls in a theatre already overflowing with limitless slaughter. The exhausted Imperial Guard and the frenzied orc hordes suddenly found their eternal duel shattered by the primordial masters of absolute carnage. The ash wastes vibrated beneath the thunderous footfalls of 1 million greenskins. The orc charge was an unstoppable avalanche of rusted iron and roaring muscle, converging upon the fragile Imperial lines. In the mind of a single brute, there was only the primal anticipation of crushing human bone. But the very fabric of Armageddon had been undone by the energies of the Great Rift. Before the green tide could crash against the trenchworks, reality itself screamed and tore apart. A jagged fissure of bleeding light split the poisoned sky. From the sickening glow of this warp anomaly, a crimson gateway birthed itself in the center of the battlefield. The stench of ozone and brimstone drowned out the fumes of promethium. Hell had come to Armageddon. Legions of bloodletters, the horned foot soldiers of Khorne, poured from the rift in an endless screaming tide. They raised their hellblades, shrieking for skulls to feed the brass throne. For a fraction of a second, a profound confusion washed over the orc horde. Their momentum faltered as the ash wastes erupted into unnatural fire. Yet this hesitation evaporated the moment the first demon cleaved an orc in twain. Confusion gave way to an unfathomable, ecstatic joy. The greenskins cared nothing for the origins of these crimson butchers, only that they presented a new and terrifyingly violent challenge. With deafening roars of approval, the orcs abandoned their human prey and hurled themselves at the legions of the blood god. What followed was a slaughter that defied mortal comprehension. Chain axes met warp-forged brass in a catastrophic symphony of carnage. The sheer volume of blood spilled was enough to lubricate the gears of war for millennia. As the two most bellicose forces in the galaxy tore each other to pieces, the warp bled heavily into the material realm. The toxic ash of the wasteland began to transmute into something utterly abhorrent. The soil pulsed and bubbled, turning into a foul amalgam of bruised flesh and coagulated gore. From the very walls of the Imperial trenches, unnatural growths burst forth. Towering trees of calcified bone erupted from the earth, their branches tipped with razor-sharp spurs that impaled anyone unfortunate enough to be standing near. The landscape itself was demonified, reflecting the murderous intent of the Imperium. Trapped within their crumbling fortifications, the mortal defenders of the Astra Militarum could only watch in paralyzed horror. They were witnesses to an incomprehensible apocalypse, a nightmare where green and red annihilated one another with joyous abandon. Guardsmen clutched their laser guns with white knuckles, their minds fracturing under the weight of such surreal devastation. They watched as a bloodletter severed the head of a massive orc, only for another greenskin to crush the demon beneath a spiked boot. Yet the brief respite afforded to the humans was nothing but a cruel illusion. Whenever an isolated pocket of melee concluded, the blood-soaked victors, be they grinning greenskin or roaring demon, slowly turned their burning eyes back toward the trembling human lines. The shadow of utter annihilation fell over the remaining mortals, demanding an immediate salvation from the stars. Through the blazing viewport of a descent craft, the son of Vulcan bears silent witness to the butchery of a world. Armageddon is no longer a mere war zone of the Imperium of man. It has been violently fractured into overlapping planes of madness, a grim diorama of the abyss anchored in physical space. To step onto the ash wastes now is to wade through the bleeding membrane between the materium and the turbulent currents of the Empyrean. The salamanders plummet into a biosphere fundamentally broken by the ruinous powers. They do not come as saviors to deliver the innocent, for there is nothing left of the original world to truly save. They come only as armored wardens of a doomed realm. Armageddon has been formally reclassified by the High Lords as a cosmic containment zone. The Imperium now pours its greatest warriors into this cursed dirt solely to prevent the demonic rot from engulfing the wider sector. As the ceramite boots of the Adeptus Astartes crush the corrupted, fleshy soil, a suffocating sensory overload assaults their genetically engineered physiology. The acrid, familiar stench of burning promethium violently clashes with the rotting sweetness of Xenos fungal spores. Beneath these terrestrial odors lies the choking, sulphurous reek of primordial brimstone and unholy ash. The physical geography of the planet openly rebels against the laws of sanity. Across the shattered equator, the rusted, sprawling scrap architecture of massive orc shanty towns is violently bisected by literal rivers of boiling blood. Monstrous greenskin strongholds, hastily constructed from the salvaged husks of Imperial macro forges, stand defiantly against rolling tides of screaming warp spawn. The Xenos hordes do not flee the waking nightmare that has swallowed the continent. Instead, they revel in the promise of eternal slaughter, turning the chaotic mutation of the land into their own paradise of endless carnage. It is a living purgatory for the scattered, terrified human enclaves desperately clinging to life in the deepest, most heavily fortified levels of the remaining hives. The Sons of Nocturne march directly into this inferno, unleashing their flamers to carve out safe havens for the survivors, but they fight under a shadow that grows darker with every passing cycle. Chilling whispers echo through the warp-tainted static of the military Vox networks. Heretic cultists and raving street prophets speak of a colossal dread stirring in the deepest trenches of the Imperium. They scream that the Red Angel is turning his furious, bloodshot gaze back upon the world that once dared to banish him. The shadow of the Daemon Primarch Angron looms heavily over the fractured plains of Armageddon. The warp hungers to finish the apocalyptic butchery that was thwarted during the legendary First War. Every drop of blood spilled by human, xenos and demon only serves to thin the veil further, feeding a sacrificial ritual of unimaginable planetary proportions. The entire world vibrates like a tightening string, ready to snap under the psychic weight of a returning god of war. Yet the creeping dread of the bloody Primarch is not the only ancient force being drawn back to this apocalyptic crucible. Across the freezing gulfs of the void, a truly unfathomable armada gathers momentum, driven forward by violent visions of a great green destiny. The ultimate convergence of blood and iron is rapidly approaching, as the mighty prophet of the Waaagh turns his singular brutal will toward his bleeding holy land. In the suffocating shadows of a demon bone thicket, a lone Imperial scout watched the bleeding sky tear completely open. The endless stalemate of warp-spawned horrors and desperate human defenders was shattered by a violent, unnatural birth of rust and scrap. A fleet of unimaginable scale violently displaced the Immaterium, vomiting itself into real space with a deafening cosmic roar. Gargantuan space hulks, scarred by the tides of the warp and bristling with crude macro-cannons, blotted out the cursed stars. The great beast had returned to his favoured crucible. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka descended upon the ash wastes of Armageddon once more. He was no longer merely a warlord seeking a momentary conquest. To the prophet of the Waaagh, this nightmare realm of boiling blood and twisted brass was no longer just a tactical objective. It had become profoundly sacred ground. Armageddon was now the ultimate Valhalla of the Orc race. It was a holy temple of eternal warfare, where the absolute strongest could fight forever against the most terrifying nightmares the galaxy could conjure. He had not returned to save this ruined sphere, nor simply to destroy it. He had come to claim his absolute masterpiece. The mightiest greenskin in history looked upon a literal demon world and saw only a glorious theme park of eternal slaughter. His very presence defied the chaotic gods that sought to consume the planet. Ghazghkull himself was a terrifying monument to the sheer, stubborn resilience of his brutal species. Following his fabled decapitation by the Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane, the beast had been reborn in a grotesque symphony of crude surgery and pure, unadulterated defiance. His massive, scarred head was viciously bolted and stapled onto a monstrous, Frankenstein-esque chassis of thick adamantium and hissing hydraulic muscle. He was a walking dreadnought of stitched flesh and battered metal, towering over the mightiest champions of both the Imperium and the ruinous powers. Cables the thickness of ancient tree trunks pumped aggressive stimulants into his overgrown, warp-infused veins. His metal jaw snapped with the force of a tectonic fault, hungry for the blood of demons and space marines alike. The sheer gravitational pull of his pure brutality drew untold millions of greenskins across the dimensional veil. They poured from the burning heavens in hollowed-out asteroids, roaring with a collective ecstasy that drowned out the shrieks of the surrounding warp. Ghazghkull led the charge into the deepest heart of the demonic incursions, his colossal power claw tearing through the fabric of reality and hellish flesh with equal contempt. He sought to test his newly resurrected might against the endless frenzied tides of the blood god and the desperate bleeding remnants of the Astra Militarum. There was no longer any sane logic left to the defense of Armageddon. The world was a monumental meat grinder operating at absolute critical mass, fueled entirely by the manic joy of a warlord who had conquered death itself. For the scout trembling in the bone thicket, and for every exhausted human soul trapped in the radioactive ashes below, the true horror of the Fourth War had just dawned. The fragile calculus of human survival was violently rewritten as the heavy boots of 1,000,000 orcs hit the corrupted dirt. The collision of green flesh and warp-spawned horror leaves the Imperial defenders trapped in the belly of an unfathomable beast. To understand the true terror of the Fourth War for Armageddon, one must look through the bloodshot eyes of a deep trench veteran. This is a soldier born in the subterranean levels of a besieged hive, a man who has literally never seen a blue sky. Above his head churns a toxic canopy of radioactive ash, burning promethium and bleeding warp rifts. There are no front lines anymore. The classical doctrines of the Astra Militarum have dissolved entirely into feral, subterranean survivalism. The great hive cities are no longer strategic fortresses. They are isolated islands of rotting steel, drowning in an ocean of absolute madness. This is the essence of the Endless Meatgrinder, a core truth of the Dark Millennium made physically manifest upon a single cursed world. High command is a delusion. Strategic objectives no longer exist. Generals do not draw lines on tactical slates to claim territory or secure vital resources. The ragged guardsmen of Armageddon are not fighting to win this war. They are fighting merely to survive the next 5 minutes. The reality of their daily existence is a surreal, exhausting nightmare that shatters the mortal mind long before the body fails. A surviving conscript might find himself repelling a roaring orc brute in the morning hours, choking on the stench of xenos spores and crude engine exhaust. By noon, the very geometry of the battlefield shifts under the weight of a local warp breach. That same trembling soldier must then fix his bayonet to fend off a frenzied bloodletter of Khorne, screaming prayers to the Emperor as reality burns around him. When the artificial night cycle finally brings absolute darkness, he is forced to strangle a mutated cultist in the irradiated mud just to secure a half-empty ration tin. There is no rest, no rotation, and no hope of extraction. In this suffocating abyss, the calculus of human worth has been utterly inverted. A single functional lasgun charge is worth vastly more than the terrified soul who carries it. Men and women die by the hundreds of thousands for a few inches of shattered rockcrete, only for that same ground to be swallowed by a demonic anomaly moments later. The conflict has lost all conventional military structure, devolving into a primal, self-sustaining ecosystem of perpetual violence. Mortal flesh feeds the shattered earth, the ruined earth breeds the endless orcs, and the ceaseless slaughter acts as a psychic beacon that draws the horrors of the warp ever deeper into the material plane. The noble sacrifice of the Imperial Guard has been rendered completely devoid of tactical meaning. They are nothing but bloody gristle caught in the grinding teeth of two cosmic predators. To those few scarred scholars of the Holy Ordos who watch this nightmare unfold from afar, the entire planet has begun to reveal a terrifying underlying truth. Deep beneath the ash-choked crust of the hive world, within the absolute silence of a shielded inquisitorial bunker, the chaotic data streams of the surface war finally coalesced into a singular, terrifying pattern. Agents of the Holy Ordos sifted through endless terabytes of intercepted greenskin vox chatter and overlapping warp echoes. Their cogitators hummed with the translated madness of a billion Xenos minds. What they found hidden within the guttural roars and static-laced battle cries was not the primitive strategy of a mindless brute, but the divine architecture of a prophet. The Inquisition was forced to confront a reality so profound and heretical that it threatened to shatter the sanity of the scribes who deciphered it. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the beast of Armageddon, had outplayed the finest minds of the Imperium on a cosmic and philosophical scale. The horrifying truth was that the arch-dictator of Gork and Mork did not actually want to conquer Armageddon. If the greenskins achieved total victory, the planetary slaughter would end, the great engine of conflict would fall silent, and the local orc population would stagnate. Conquest was a mortal ambition, a human frailty entirely beneath the grand, monstrous vision of the prophet. He sought something far more eternal and blasphemous. Ghazghkull desired an absolute, unbreakable equilibrium in a three-way apocalyptic war without end. Armageddon was never meant to be a trophy to be claimed and pacified. It was meticulously designed to be a crucible of infinite violence. By locking the military might of the Imperium into a perpetual stalemate against untold billions of orc spores and the endless tides of chaos, Ghazghkull had successfully created the ultimate proving ground. Armageddon had been intentionally transformed into a bespoke factory for the greenskin race. It was a world-sized anvil powered by rivers of Imperial blood and tempered by the foul heat of demonic magic. Every fresh Astra Militarum regiment fed into the grinding trenches, every Space Marine strike force deployed to the ash wastes, and every god machine that fell screaming into the dust only served to elevate the scale of the violence. The Inquisition realized with cold, suffocating despair that the Imperium of man was merely providing the whetstone upon which the orc race was sharpening its fangs. The beast was actively farming the stubborn resilience of humanity to cultivate the largest, hardest, and most vicious generation of greenskins the galaxy had ever seen. To the orcs, this devastated, bleeding sphere was a holy paradise of infinite warfare. There would be no escape, no genuine victory, and no final dawn for the human defenders. The planet was eternally locked in a horrific stasis of perpetual slaughter, ordained by an Xenos intellect that fed upon the very act of human resistance. This grim revelation remained sealed away in the darkest vaults of the Inquisition, kept far from the desperate millions fighting and dying on the surface. The soldiers in the mud could not be allowed to know that their heroic sacrifices were merely the fuel for an Xenos god's grand design. And so the grinding wheels of the colossal war machine turned blindly onward, utterly indifferent to the souls being crushed beneath them. Below the toxic clouds and ruined spires, the true cost of this eternal stalemate was not measured in spent bolter shells or burnt promethium, but in the innocent flesh borne directly into the jaws of the meat grinder. An entirely new breed of humanity was taking its first desperate breaths in the suffocating darkness of the lower habs, knowing nothing of peace, nothing of hope, and nothing but the war that was their birthright. Far removed from the sprawling war rooms of the Segmentum Solar, beneath the gaze of golden admirals and demigods, lies the true foundation of our enduring empire. We must cast our eyes down from the burning heavens and peer into the darkest sub-levels of a besieged manufactorum. Here, amidst the suffocating smog and the relentless pounding of subterranean forge hammers, we find the ultimate distillation of the human condition in this dark millennium. It is not a space marine in gleaming ceramite, nor a saint wreathed in holy fire. It is a child, born upon a bed of spent brass casings and cooling iron slag. This infant will never know the touch of soft linen, nor the warmth of a mother who has the luxury of time to weep. Before this child can fully walk, small and soot-stained hands will be wrapped tightly around the grip of a standard pattern lasgun. This is not an anomaly of a single desperate siege, but the deliberate and necessary calculus of our species. Total war is no longer an event that begins and ends, but the very atmospheric pressure in which humanity breathes. Entire generations are spawned in the lightless depths for the sole purpose of feeding the meat grinder of an endless trench line. If you were to speak to this child of a tree, they would look at you with hollow incomprehension. They have never seen a leaf, nor felt the gentle caress of an unpolluted breeze against their skin. They do not know what silence sounds like. For these children, the absence of artillery fire is not peace, but merely the terrifying prelude to a bloody bayonet charge. Their entire reality is defined by the harsh recoil of a rifle against a bruised shoulder and the choking stench of burning promethium. These sensory horrors are the incense and the hymns of their singular, inescapable religion. The God Emperor is not a benevolent shepherd to them, but the supreme master of ordnance, a distant deity demanding an unending tithe of blood and bone. This absolute militarization strips away every vestige of what ancient philosophers once called innocence. Every story, every lullaby, every cultural memory has been violently burned away, replaced by firing drills and maintenance litanies. To survive the unfathomable horrors of a hostile galaxy, mankind has willingly forged itself into a weapon of unyielding iron. Yet in doing so, we have paid the most terrible price imaginable. We have secured the physical continuation of the human race by meticulously exterminating our own humanity. The child simply stares down the iron sights, eyes dead and unblinking, waiting for the shadows in the corridor to move. There is no hope for tomorrow in those pale eyes, only the immediate and brutal present of the next volley. This silent vigil in the dark is repeated across 1,000,000 ruined worlds. It is a vast and tragic choir singing a song of eternal defiance in the face of extinction. This unending sacrifice paves a bloody road toward the final reckoning that awaits us all. Ascend from the choking trenches and pierce the toxic veil of the atmosphere. Look down upon the world of Armageddon from the cold silence of the high void. It is no longer a world of the Emperor, nor a domain of the Xenos, nor a realm claimed by the ruinous powers. It is a diseased sphere of swirling ash, veined with oceans of glowing lava and bleeding open from weeping violet warp rifts. To look upon this broken globe is to gaze into the true heart of our dark age. Every crater is a mass grave, and every ruined hive is a tombstone. The first war for Armageddon was a terrible secret, a demonic incursion erased from history by the blood of the innocent and the merciless purges of the Inquisition. The Second War was a legendary clash of titans, an apocalyptic duel born of Imperial arrogance and the unstoppable green tide of the beast. The Third War was a staggering global siege of supreme endurance, where the greatest heroes of humanity stood unbroken against a galaxy consumed by absolute hatred. But the Fourth War has evolved into something far more horrifying. The Fourth War is eternity. Down there in the toxic smog and the irradiated ruins, the conflict has entirely transcended the need for victory. Victory is an obsolete concept, an ancient myth whispered by the dying to comfort the doomed children born into the trenches. Mankind, orc and demon are now locked in a grotesque, unwinnable embrace of mutual annihilation. They blindly feed a planetary meat grinder that spans continents, fueled by the flesh of countless billions who have never known a sky free of fire. This three-way apocalypse will not end until the mantle of the planet shatters, the core goes cold, and the stars themselves burn out in the heavens. Armageddon has become far more than a mere celestial body or a strategic prize. It is the ultimate physical manifestation of the 41st millennium. It is a vast, planetary crucible where every shred of hope is burned away to leave only the raw, fundamental truth of our existence. There are no saviors coming to break this stalemate. There is no divine intervention waiting in the dark spaces between the stars to deliver the righteous. There is only the endless cycle of slaughter perpetuated by desperate species that have long forgotten how to do anything but kill. If the history of our wretched galaxy is a tragic tapestry, then this dying planet is its most defining masterpiece. It stands as the purest, most terrible monument to the ancient, undeniable axiom of our era. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Listen closely to the cold silence of the void, and you will hear the true echo of Armageddon. It is the bleak, soulless sound of heavy, grinding machinery, endlessly churning shattered steel and ruined flesh together in the dark, forever.